Hi guys, welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate to you how to create colorful and tonal gradients using wet watercolor techniques. I will show you step by step how to work with those techniques and also how to create extra textures using washing out effects and dry brush. My name is Irina Kay and I'm an artist and art educator. Today I'm going to draw this purplish gemstone, and if you would like to work with me and create your painting step by step, you can find the link to this reference in the description below. I would like to show you some examples of artworks so you will have better understanding of what actually you can do with that skill that you're going to learn today. These pieces that you could see now, I created using smooth gradations with watercolor wet techniques, creating gradients using lighter and darker tones, basically with the same colors. So if you would like to draw something like this handbag or other types of gemstones, or maybe you would like to work with some silky textures like on this shoe or these drapes. So from all these cases, you will need to use wet watercolor techniques in order to create the smooth gradations between lighter tones and shades. And if you would like to create a smooth transition between more than two colors. For example, on this dress, you could see some fragments with very visible borders between, let's say, black and grayish colors. So in this case, you're not using wet technique, you're using dry brush or creating a layer of paint on the dry paper. And if you see fragments where black color is smoothly mixing and creating even effects with gray, darker gray and lighter gray colors. So in these cases, you're using wet technique and you're working with gradient. So whatever you're starting to draw, first you need to understand for yourself if you work on a dry surface or if you work on a wet surface, because you already have an idea what difference will be between these effects. The first step, I always start with mixing colors that I might use for work and trying to use similar type of paper so I can see how colors will look like when they get dry. Remember that it depends on the amount of water you add into the color to see how light or how dark it will be. Don't use white. In this tutorial, I decided to use wet technique and gradients directly on the artwork without doing it on a separate pieces of paper. So even if you do it first time, there is not much risk for you. I recommend start to work first not with the main and central part of the gemstone. Start practice smooth color gradations somewhere on the smaller surfaces, let's say on the bottom, as I started to do that. There are several ways how you can create gradients with watercolor. And in this case, I started with covering the whole fragment with a lighter color, lighter pinkish, and while the surface is still wet, so you have to make sure that you covered it with enough of paint and it will not get dry too quickly. Then you can start to add second color. In our case, it's a purple, and this purple is a little bit thicker, less liquid, and I'm starting to add it at the very top of the fragment. The brush, I still can shape direction how I want paint to spread. Now I want to add extra texture to that part of the gemstone, and I'm going to use washing out effect. I'm cleaning my brush and making it drier. And as I know that the surface is still a little bit wet, it's quite easy for me to take off some amount of paint with that dry brush. Next fragment of gemstone, I'm starting with outlining the edge between two surfaces. And this type of brush with really sharp tip is helping a lot, making this process easier. As you might notice, I didn't start working with the wet surface. I didn't cover it first with the paint. So this is a different approach of how to create gradient without covering first the surface. Anyway, it's gonna be smooth and quite transitional among several colors. So what you have to pay attention now is that every color, that amount of paint that you apply will not get dry too quickly. So it means you uh, add in a little bit more and more of paint, and once you start to add this, let's say the second paint as I started now, you might notice that they're still mixing a little bit. So I'm changing the brush for a bigger size because now I don't have to be so precise, and it will be a little bit quicker to work on the bigger surface. As you notice that there is still soft gradient between darker purple and that pinkish color that I'm using. And while the surface is still wet, I can kind of mix these two colors a little bit together. I'm adding brownish and a little bit of purplish colors. But the most important part, again, pay attention that once you add in the next color, doesn't matter third, fifth color, you have to make sure that that surface that you add into is still a little bit wet. So then you won't see any dry brush strokes, and you will be able to create a nice and smooth gradient among the colors that you're using. So now I'm continuing adding a little bit of brownish color. As you notice that I added darker brown, then darker you want to make next color, you have to make sure that the paint is a little bit thicker, less liquid, and in this case the paint will not spread too quickly. Again, I'm going to create a little bit of texture on that surface by washing out a little bit of paint, and the surface is still wet, and it makes it easier to remove some amount of paint in the places that I desire. What is important here is that you make your brush clean and dry, because if you will add some extra water, you probably will create not a desirable effect. I will not continue to add two extra details, and now I just make sure that this piece is already got dry and I can continue to work on some other fragments. Now I'm very carefully touching that part that I worked on before, making sure that both parts go dry. I'm starting to work on the next part of the gemstone, which is next to the fragment that I already worked, and I'm covering the whole part with the lightest pinkish color and adding a little bit of brownish and purplish on the sides. So I'm kind of going back to that first version of creating gradient, making first wet surface and then adding a little bit thicker, less liquid paint on the bottom and on the top of the fragment. Then darker or brighter or more intense color you want to have on your gradient, you will need to add less liquid paint, like more concentrated, obviously because you will have there less amount of water because you already have water on that wet surface that you're using for gradient. Once you will start practicing gradients more often in your work, you will notice that creating a gradient on a smaller surface is much easier than on a bigger one. So that's why I suggested you to start to work not with the biggest and the main surface of the gemstone, so you can practice more on a lower part of the gemstone with smaller pieces. And if something doesn't go well enough in some case, it won't be so well visible because it's not in the center of your artwork, then you might notice also that working with light gradients are easier than if you want to create, let's say, brighter gradients or darker gradients. It's a little bit more practice, but you still will be able to do it gradually, working on the whole gemstone, you will notice how from surface to surface is becoming a little bit easier. And by that time that you will start to work on the central part of your gemstone, you probably will be ready to create really nice and smooth gradients. Now I'm going to use slightly different way of creating gradient. I started covering surface with pinkish color, and then the rest of the surface is so light that I don't really want to add any extra color. I'm just covering surface with clean water and helping my brush merge these two wet surfaces into one nice gradient. Before you started covering some surface with the gradient, I would suggest you take a look and decide which color is the main color for that surface. Let's say I have quite light surface with very light pink and light purple color. So that will be my first choice, and I will start to cover with that color that covering the most of the surface, and then add smaller amount of brighter or more intense color then closer the next step. So it's pretty obvious that it might be much easier to start with lightest colors and with the color that takes the most space on the surface. Now I'm using more intense purple color on the top of that fragment that I was working on, and I'm covering it with less liquid paint. So the color is more intense, and I know that once it will get dry, it will be much brighter than the slight pinkish purplish that I have. And I also know that the previous gradient already got dry, and darker paint will not spread so well. So what I'm doing in this case, I'm prolonging that effect of gradient and covering a little bit surface with clean or very very light toned paint to mix visually darker purple and the lighter gradient that already got dry. And for the end of that fragment, I'm going to use more intense purple and add there a little amount of ultramarine. As I see, there are some color gradations on the reference. Although you don't have to follow every single detail that you see on your drawing, I still appreciate these moments using observational skills when you're thinking about some smaller details in your drawing. Now I'm planning to go to work on some brighter, more colorful parts. This too, and just making sure that this sides get dry so I can work. I have to be very patient and sometimes just to sit and wait till some part will get dry, although it might be really difficult sometimes. So one solution that I found for myself is switching from the areas where you work. And I like this side because I can play with a little bit more different colors. You might notice that I didn't cover the surface before I started to apply all these bright colors. But I'm trying to keep attention that this paint in a closer to uncovered area is still a little bit wet. The trick here that you work on a dry surface and you have to keep your paint wet enough so you apply enough of paint on the paper that it will not get dry too quickly. For example, if you do the brush stroke and you see already that paint is getting drier, so it means you definitely need to add more paint or water. But in the same moment, you don't want to make paint lighter, so you just need to create to mix more paint for this technique to use. As well, it's not really good idea for very bright and intense colors to start to use first wet surface, as your paint will mix with that water that you already have on the paper, and color won't be so intense. So what might help in this case, if you still trying to make it very bright and you're using wet surface, is kind of creating second layer while paint is still wet, but that might be also very tricky. So the best would be to create even more concentrated paint, so once it mixes in with water it won't become too light. As you might notice that for this fragment of gemstone, I'm actually not trying to create so smooth and soft gradient, and I'm using my brush strokes and keeping them a little bit visible on the wet surface. So I'm trying to make more visible texture on this part. For the next part of gemstone, I'm using kind of similar technique that I used just before it. I'm starting with very intense dark paint, keeping in mind that I need to have enough of paint on my brush so that it's not getting dried too quickly on the paper. And then I'm planning to continue with a lighter paint, and I'm changing my brush in the purpose to not spending time on cleaning brush while the paint is still wet, so I want to be a little bit quicker. And I continue to spread a little bit of brighter paint over that lighter color that I'm applying. So while the surface is still wet, you still can work a little bit with mixing that paint on the border between brighter color and lighter tones, which is really helpful for you because you still can adjust amount of gradient if you want to keep it more brighter or a little bit lighter. As you see, I'm still trying to make it even a little bit brighter, that color that I mentioned before, kind of creating the second layer. So with some types of paper it works pretty well, like in my case, and makes in color a little bit bright, a little bit more intense. So I'm using also dry brush to create a little bit texture on the top, and now moving on the bottom and adding a little bit texture over there. For that small part of the gemstone which I'm working at this moment, I added a little bit of purple and washing out it carefully with almost transparent water with almost clean brush, spreading the paint a little bit and creating the gradient without adding second color. On the slight pink part of the gemstone, I'm adding a little bit of details. So the surface already got dry, and with a thin brush, smaller size, I can add on the top some kind of triangle shapes, adding a little more texture. So you can notice that in this area, the paint moved a little bit over the border that I didn't plan to have this effect. And now using a flat brush, I'm going to wash out a little bit that extra paint on the side that I don't really want to see it. And I'm trying to create now a more visible outline between two sides of the gemstone. There are left just a couple of more small surfaces where you can safely train and practice your gradient skills before you started to work on the better visible part where you have to be a little bit more precise than what you're doing at this moment. I'm working now on very light part of the gradient, which is relatively easy to do. I'm using some warm pink color and adding a little bit of purple. As this tutorial is quite long, I decided to separate it in two videos. And the most exciting part, the bigger surface gradient, I'm gonna demonstrate you in the next video. So please subscribe to be notified when next video will go online. As well, if you would like to ask any questions, so feel free to leave them under this video. I will be happy to reply on them. Please also like video if you find it helpful and informative. It will help other people to find easier, valuable information, and it will encourage me to create more creative content for you. Meanwhile, have an artful day and see you in the next video.